The dollar bargain. Eleanor Finch's trembling hand clutched her last dollar as she stood before a row of hollow-eyed orphans, her pregnant belly pressing against her threadbare coat. The orphanage matron's voice echoed cold through the December air. "Choose quickly, Mrs. Finch. Winter doesn't wait for sentiment." Eleanor's gaze fell on two silent brothers huddled in the corner. Lucas, 14, with eyes too old for his face, and Noah, 10, who hadn't spoken since arrival. She needed hands to save her failing ranch before her baby came. She needed survival. What she didn't know was that these boys carried a secret that would shatter everything she thought she knew about the man she'd loved and buried 6 months ago. If you're watching from somewhere in this world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels. And if this story grabs you, hit that like button and stay until the very end. You won't believe where this goes. The Wyoming Territory wind cut through Eleanor Finch's coat like a rusty blade as she stood on the sagging porch of the Salvation Ridge holding house for displaced youth. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving gray wood exposed to the elements like bones picked clean. Inside, she could hear the shuffle of small feet, the cough of sickness, the silence of children who'd learned that crying brought nothing. Her hand moved to her belly, 5 months swollen now, though she'd barely been eating enough to keep herself upright. Beneath her palm, the baby shifted, a reminder of everything she stood to lose. The door opened. Mrs. Havering stood in the frame, a woman built like a fence post, all angles and judgment. Her eyes traveled from Eleanor's worn boots to her patched dress to the obvious swell beneath her coat. "Mrs. Finch." The name came out flat, neither welcoming nor dismissive. "You're late." The road from Broken Creek took longer than expected. Eleanor's voice came out steadier than she felt. "The snow inside." Mrs. Havering stepped back, allowing just enough room for Eleanor to pass without their bodies touching, as if poverty might be contagious. The holding house interior smelled of lye soap, boiled cabbage, and that particular scent of too many unwashed bodies in too small a space. A fire burned low in the hearth, just enough to keep the pipes from freezing, not enough for actual warmth. Along the far wall, approximately 20 children sat on benches, arranged by height. Their faces held that peculiar emptiness Eleanor had seen in the mirror lately, the look of people who'd stopped expecting anything good. "These are the ones available for indenture." Mrs. Havering gestured toward the children like a shopkeeper indicating merchandise. "The older boys are strongest, naturally, but they come with histories." She said the word histories the way some people said disease. "The younger ones are more manageable." Eleanor's throat tightened. She'd told herself during the long wagon ride that this was practical, necessary, survival. But standing here, looking at these children who'd already lost everything, the words indenture and available tasted like ash. "I need..." She paused, steadied herself. "I need workers. My ranch is small, 40 acres, mostly grazing land. My husband passed in June. The baby comes in April. I need hands who can work hard through winter and spring." Mrs. Havering's expression didn't shift. "You understand the terms? 5-year indenture minimum. You provide room, board, basic education if they're under 12. They work as directed. Legal contract, witnessed and filed with the territorial office." "I understand." "And the placement fee?" Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a single crumpled dollar bill. It was everything, the last of what she'd gotten from selling her wedding ring, her mother's cameo, the silver candlesticks that had been a wedding gift. The money from selling the cattle herd had gone to pay the land taxes. The money from selling her mare had bought seed for spring planting. This dollar was the difference between making it through winter or losing everything before her baby drew its first breath. Mrs. Havering took the bill, held it up to the dim light as if checking its authenticity, then tucked it into her apron pocket. $1 buys you 1 child. Choose." Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides. She'd known this, had prepared herself for it during the sleepless nights in her empty cabin. But hearing it stated so plainly, a child for $1, as if human worth could be measured in currency, made something crack inside her chest. She walked slowly along the line of children. They didn't meet her eyes. Some stared at the floor. Others looked past her, through her, at nothing. A girl of perhaps 8 with a persistent cough. Too young, too fragile for the work Eleanor needed. A boy of 12 with a club foot. Eleanor's heart ached, but she couldn't afford compassion. She needed someone who could handle a plow, split wood, manage livestock. Twin girls who clutched each other's hands. Eleanor couldn't separate them, wouldn't, but couldn't afford both. And then, at the end of the bench, two boys sat apart from the others. Not by much, just a few inches of space on either side, as if even the other orphans recognized they were different. The older one looked about 14, tall for his age but whipcord thin, with dark hair that fell over his eyes and a jaw set hard against the world. He wore a man's shirt cut down to fit, the sleeves still too long. His hands, resting on his knees, were scarred across the knuckles. The marks of someone who'd been in fights or done hard labor, or both. The younger boy, perhaps 10, sat pressed against his brother's side. He was smaller, softer in the face, with the same dark hair but eyes that still held a flicker of something that hadn't been completely extinguished. He wore a coat that was too large, the hem brushing the floor, sleeves rolled multiple times. "Those two," Eleanor heard herself say. "The brothers." Mrs. Havering's eyebrows rose. "You said you had $1. "I did. I do." Eleanor turned to face the woman. "But you said I could choose. I'm choosing them. The fee is per child. I understood you to say $1 for placement." Eleanor's voice hardened with the authority of someone who'd spent the last 6 months learning to negotiate with feed suppliers, land agents, and bank representatives who all thought a pregnant widow was easy prey. "You didn't specify that the placement was singular." A long silence stretched between them. Through the window, snow had begun to fall again, fat flakes that would make the road back to Broken Creek even more treacherous. Mrs. Havering's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Those boys are trouble. The older one has a temper. The younger one hasn't spoken a word since they arrived 3 months ago. I'm doing you a kindness by warning you." "I'll manage." "There's a reason they're still here while younger, more tractable children have been placed." "I'll still take them." Another pause. Then Mrs. Havering gave a sharp nod. "Lucas, Noah, gather your things." The older boy, Lucas, stood slowly. He pulled his brother up with him, keeping one hand on the younger boy's shoulder. Neither one looked at Eleanor. They walked toward a corner where a few cloth sacks hung on pegs, moving with the mechanical efficiency of people who'd learned not to hope for much and to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. "You'll need to sign the papers." Mrs. Havering produced a ledger and 2 contracts from a desk drawer. Lucas James Ashford, age 14, Noah Thomas Ashford, age 10, birthplace unknown, parents deceased, no living relatives. Eleanor took the pen, dipped it in ink. The names swam before her eyes for a moment. Ashford, common enough, meant nothing. She signed both contracts with a hand that wanted to shake but didn't dare. "They have a month's worth of basic rations I'll send with you. After that, their keeping is your responsibility. If they run, you have legal right to retrieval. If they're injured in your service, that's your burden. If they prove unmanageable, you cannot return them. The contract is binding." "I understand," Mrs. Havering called toward the back room. "Margaret, prepare the Ashford boys' rations." While they waited, Eleanor finally turned to look at the 2 boys fully. They stood by the door now, each holding a thin cloth sack that likely contained everything they owned in the world. Lucas stared at a point somewhere past her shoulder, his jaw still set in that hard line. Noah pressed against his brother's side, one hand clutching Lucas's sleeve. An older woman emerged from the back carrying a burlap sack of provisions. She handed it to Lucas without a word, but her eyes held something that might have been pity or warning. "Well then." Mrs. Havering folded the contracts and handed one copy to Eleanor. "They're yours now, Mrs. Finch. May you have better luck with them than we did." Eleanor led the way out into the snow. Her wagon waited where she'd left it, the mule stamping its feet against the cold. She'd brought old blankets to sit on, another to wrap around whoever she brought home. It seemed pitifully inadequate now, looking at these 2 thin boys in their insufficient clothing. "In the back," she said, gesturing to the wagon bed. "There's a blanket. Share it." Lucas helped Noah up first, then climbed in himself. They settled into this corner, pulling the blanket around their shoulders. Still, Neither one had looked directly at her. Neither one had spoken. Eleanor climbed onto the driver's bench, took up the reins, and urged the mule forward. The snow fell heavier now, muffling the sound of the wheels, turning the world into gradations of white and gray. They were an hour down the road when Noah finally made a sound, a small gasp of cold. Eleanor glanced back to see him shivering despite the blanket, his lips taking on a bluish tinge. "There's another blanket under the bench," she called back. "The oilcloth one. It's not clean, but it's warm." Lucas reached forward, found the blanket, and wrapped it around his brother. His movements were careful, almost tender. This, Eleanor realized, was what had kept them alive. This older brother who'd learned to be both parent and protector to a boy who'd stopped speaking. "How long to your place?" Lucas's voice startled her. It was deeper than she'd expected, roughened by disuse or cold, or both. 3 hours in good weather, maybe 5 in this?" Eleanor kept her eyes on the road ahead, on the barely visible ruts beneath the accumulating snow. "There's a trading post about halfway if we need to stop." Silence again. The mule plodded forward, breath steaming in the cold air. "Why us?" Lucas's question came quieter this time. Eleanor could have given him practical answers, that she needed workers old enough to handle real labor, that 2 sets of hands were better than 1, that brothers might be more reliable than a single child with no ties. All of those things were true, but she found herself saying something else. "Because you look like you know how to survive, and survival is all I'm asking for right now." The truth of it hung in the air between them. No false promises of family or warmth or belonging, just the hard arithmetic of making it through winter. "What kind of work?" Lucas asked. Lucas, everything. Feeding livestock, mucking stalls, splitting wood, hauling water, mending fence. When spring comes, planting. The ranch is small enough that every hand matters. She paused. "I won't lie to you, it'll be hard work. The cabin is drafty and the food is plain, but you'll have a roof and 3 meals, and I don't raise my hand to children." "That why you bought us?" There was something sharp in Lucas's voice now. Cheap labor? Eleanor's hands tightened on the reins. She could have been offended. Should have been, maybe. But there was too much truth in his words. "Yes," she said simply. "I bought you because I'm desperate. Because I'm pregnant and alone and about to lose everything my husband built. Because I needed help, and $1 was all I had left in this world." She turned slightly, enough to catch his eyes. "But what happens after we get through winter? That depends on all of us." Something flickered in Lucas's expression. Not softening exactly, but a slight easing of that hard-set jaw. Recognition, maybe, of honesty when he heard it. They reached the trading post as darkness fell. Eleanor pulled the wagon around back where there was a lean-to for animals. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Callahan, emerged from the building. "Eleanor Finch." He nodded to her, then glanced at the boys. "Picked up some help, I see." "Lucas and Noah Ashford. They'll be working my place through winter." Callahan's eyes lingered on the boys a moment longer than necessary, that same assessing look Mrs. Havering had given them. Whatever he saw, he kept his thoughts to himself. "Storm's getting worse. You're welcome to bed down in the storage room if you need. No charge. Just don't touch the inventory." "Thank you, but we'll push through. I've got livestock that need feeding." "Suit yourself. Safe travels." They continued into the darkness, the snow now falling so thick that Eleanor could barely see the mule's head in front of her. She hunched into her coat, every part of her body aching with cold and exhaustion. Behind her, she could hear Noah's teeth chattering despite the blankets. "How much further?" Lucas called forward. "Another hour, maybe less." But it was closer to 2 hours before the dim outline of the cabin appeared through the snow. It sat at the base of a foothill, sheltered by a stand of pines, with a small barn and corral off to one side. Eleanor had never been so grateful to see that sagging roof, those patched walls, that thin stream of smoke from the chimney she'd banked before leaving that morning. She pulled the wagon up to the barn. "Help me get the mule unhitched, then we'll get inside." They worked together in the cold and darkness, Eleanor unhitching the harness, Lucas leading the mule into a stall, Noah gathering their few belongings from the wagon. The barn smelled of hay and animal warmth. infinitely preferable to the biting wind outside. "There are 2 cows and a pig," Eleanor said, pointing to the stalls. "They'll need feeding in the morning. Hay is stored in the loft. Water pump is outside. It hasn't frozen yet, but it will soon." Lucas nodded, taking it all in with those watchful eyes. They trudged through the snow to the cabin. Eleanor pushed open the door, and whatever warmth had remained from the morning fire rushed out to meet them. She quickly shut the door behind the boys and moved to stoke the fire, adding wood until flames caught and began to push back the darkness. The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft accessible by ladder. A table and 4 chairs occupied the center. A cook stove sat against one wall, a wash basin and cupboard against another. Eleanor's bed, the bed she'd shared with her husband, occupied the far corner, covered now with quilts she'd made during her first winter here, when she'd been a new bride and thought love could conquer the loneliness of frontier life. "The loft is yours," she said, gesturing upward. "There are 2 old mattresses up there, some extra blankets. Not much, but it's warmer than the barn." Lucas set down his sack and helped Noah climb the ladder. Eleanor heard them moving around overhead, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of blankets. She heated water on the stove, made a simple soup from dried beans and the last of some salt pork. Her hands moved automatically through motions she'd performed 1,000 times, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating how long their food stores would last with 2 extra mouths, planning out tomorrow's work, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. "Food's ready," she called up. They descended the ladder and sat at the table. Eleanor ladled soup into tin bowls, set out a half loaf of bread she'd made 2 days ago. For several minutes, the only sound was the scrape of spoons against metal. Noah ate hungrily, both hands wrapped around his bowl as if afraid someone might take it. Lucas ate more slowly, methodically, his eyes constantly moving, to the windows, to the door, to Eleanor, back to his brother. "There's more if you want it," Eleanor said. Lucas shook his head. Noah looked like he might want more, but didn't ask. Eleanor refilled Noah's bowl without comment. When they finished, Lucas started to gather the bowls, but Eleanor waved him off. "Tomorrow. It's been a long day. Get some sleep." They climbed back up to the loft. Eleanor heard them settling in, the murmur of Lucas's voice too low to make out words, then silence. She sat alone by the fire, one hand on her belly, where the baby shifted and turned. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin's corners, finding every crack and gap in the walls. Tomorrow she'd have Lucas help her pack more mud and straw mixture into those gaps. Tomorrow, they'd start the real work. Tonight, she was too tired to think beyond the fact that she was no longer alone. She banked the fire, changed into her nightgown, and crawled into bed. The sheets were cold against her skin. She curled on her side, pulling the quilts up to her chin, and closed her eyes. Sleep came quickly, but it was not restful. She dreamed of her husband, Thomas, with his easy smile and his promises that everything would work out, that they'd build something lasting here in Wyoming territory. In her dream, he stood at the edge of the property line, looking back at the cabin. But when she called his name, he turned and walked away, disappearing into a horizon that went on forever. She woke in darkness to the sound of voices overhead. Not loud, but urgent enough to pull her from sleep. "Can't stay here," Lucas's voice, pitched low but intense. A pause. Then Noah, so quiet Eleanor almost missed it. "Where would we go?" Her breath caught. Noah had spoken. The boy who supposedly hadn't said a word in 3 months had spoken. "Anywhere. Back to Denver, maybe. We could find work. You're 14. I'm 10. Nobody's hiring us. Better than this. Better than being some widow's bought help. She fed us. Gave us blankets. For now. You think that lasts? You think people like her are different from the rest?" Lucas's voice carried years of betrayal, of promises broken. "They're all the same. They use you up and throw you away." Silence. Eleanor lay frozen in her bed, knowing she should make a sound, should let them know she could hear, but unable to move. "He did that," Noah said finally. His voice was small, younger than 10. "Left us like we were nothing." He. Eleanor's mind raced. A father? A guardian? Someone who'd abandoned these boys before they ended up in the holding house? "Yeah, he did." Lucas's voice had gone flat, emotionless. And she was married to him. You think she's any different? The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Married to him. Married to who? Thomas? That was impossible. Thomas had no brothers, no family at all. He told her that when they married. Said he'd been alone since he was 18, that she was his family now. But something cold was sliding down her spine, a terrible suspicion taking shape. Go to sleep, Lucas said. We'll figure it out in the morning. The voices stopped. Eleanor lay in the darkness, her heart pounding so hard she thought surely they could hear it from the loft. It couldn't be true. Thomas would have told her if he had brothers. Wouldn't he? But even as she tried to convince herself, memories surfaced. Thomas's reluctance to talk about his past, the way he'd changed the subject whenever she asked about his childhood. That time she'd found an old letter in his belongings, addressed from someone named L.A., and he'd snatched it away, saying it was business correspondence that didn't concern her. L.A. Lucas Ashford. Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. If these boys were Thomas's brothers, if he'd abandoned them, left them to end up in an orphanage while he came west to build a new life, what did that say about the man she'd married? The man whose child she carried? And what did it mean that she'd just bought his brothers for $1, brought them to work the land he'd left her, without either of them knowing the connection? The cabin walls felt too close suddenly, the air too thick. Eleanor threw back the quilts and stood, moving as quietly as she could to the window. Outside, the snow had stopped. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. She'd come to the holding house looking for survival, for hands to work her land, to help her make it through winter until her baby came. What she'd found instead was the truth, or the beginning of it, and the knowledge that the man she'd loved, the man she'd grieved, might have been someone completely different from who she'd thought. Tomorrow, she would have to face Lucas and Noah knowing what she knew. She would have to decide whether to tell them who she was, what connection she had to the brother who'd abandoned them. She would have to decide if she could look at these boys, these children her husband had left behind, and still call them her hired help. The baby shifted inside her, a reminder that whatever choices she made now affected more than just her own future. Eleanor rested her forehead against the cold glass and watched the moon track across the sky, waiting for dawn and whatever truth it might bring. Dawn broke gray and cold, the kind of morning where the sun seemed to give up before it fully rose. Eleanor had been awake for hours, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold between her hands. She'd rehearsed a dozen different ways to start the conversation, discarded them all, and come back to the simple truth that there was no good way to ask someone if their dead brother had been your husband. The ladder creaked. Lucas descended first, moving quietly, then reached back to help Noah down. Both boys looked hollow-eyed, as if they'd slept as poorly as Eleanor had. "There's porridge on the stove," Eleanor said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "And coffee, though it's strong enough to strip paint." Lucas moved to the stove, ladled porridge into 2 bowls. He handed one to Noah, kept the other for himself. They sat at the table, maintaining that same careful distance from Eleanor they'd kept yesterday. Eleanor watched them eat. Lucas had Thomas's hands, long fingers, broad across the knuckles. Noah had the same dark hair, the same widow's peak at the hairline. How had she not seen it yesterday? How had she looked at these boys and not recognized the ghost of her husband in their faces? "Because you weren't looking," a voice whispered in her head. "Because Thomas told you he had no family, and you believed him." "I need to ask you something." The words came out before she could stop them. "And I need you to tell me the truth." Lucas's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. His eyes met hers, wary and hard. "Your last name is Ashford." "You know it is. You signed the papers." "And before the orphanage, where were you?" Lucas set down his spoon slowly. "Why does it matter?" "Because I heard you last night." Eleanor's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "I heard you talking about someone who left you, someone I was married to." The silence that followed felt like a physical thing, pressing against Eleanor's chest, making it hard to breathe. Noah's eyes went wide. He looked at his brother, then back to Eleanor, his face draining of color. Lucas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You were listening. My cabin, my roof, my..." Eleanor stopped herself, forced her voice to steady. Was Thomas Ashford your brother? She watched the truth move across Lucas's face, shock first, then recognition, then something that looked almost like rage. Thomas. Lucas said the name like a curse. Thomas Finch. That's what he called himself when he left. Eleanor's world tilted sideways. He told me his name was Thomas Finch, that he'd been alone since he was 18, that his parents died in a fire back east. Our parents did die in a fire. Lucas's voice was sharp enough to cut. In St. Louis. I was 8. Noah was 4. Thomas was 20. He was supposed to take care of us. He did, Noah whispered. For a while. For 2 years. Lucas's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Then he met some woman with money and decided 2 kid brothers were inconvenient. Left us with an aunt who didn't want us, took off west to make his fortune. His laugh was bitter, brittle. Guess he found it. Found you. Eleanor felt sick. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if responding to her distress. When was this? When did he leave you? 6 years ago. I was 8. Noah was 4. You said you were 8 when your parents died. I was. Lucas's eyes blazed. Thomas left us when I was 12. Math isn't that hard. Eleanor did the calculation in her head. 6 years ago, Thomas would have been 26. He'd met Eleanor 4 years ago, married her 3.5 years ago, which meant for 2 years after abandoning his brothers, he'd been somewhere else, someone else, before he'd shown up in Broken Creek with his easy smile and his story about being alone in the world. The aunt, Eleanor managed. What happened to her? Died 2 years ago. Cholera. We ended up on the streets in Denver for a while, then got picked up and sent to the holding house. Lucas's voice was flat now, reciting facts. We figured Thomas was dead. Seemed like the only reason he wouldn't come back for us. He died in June. Eleanor's own voice sounded distant. Kicked by a horse. Broke his neck. He was gone before the doctor could get here. She waited for some reaction, grief, satisfaction, anything. But Lucas just nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already known. Good, he said simply. Noah made a small sound, quickly stifled. Don't. Lucas turned to his brother. Don't you dare defend him. He left us. Left us to starve, to freeze, to end up in that place. And now we find out he was living here with a wife and a... He gestured sharply at Eleanor's belly. A baby on the way. Don't you see? We weren't worth staying for, but she was. That's not fair, Eleanor said quietly. Fair? Lucas laughed again, that same bitter sound. You want to talk about fair? You bought us yesterday. Bought us with $1, just like he bought his new life by selling us out. So, don't talk to me about fair. The words struck like physical blows. Eleanor forced herself to sit still, to absorb them, to not flinch away from the truth in them. You're right, she said finally. I did buy you. And your brother, my husband, he did abandon you, and none of that is fair. Lucas stared at her, clearly not expecting agreement. But I didn't know. Eleanor met his eyes steadily. I didn't know about you. He never told me he had brothers. Never mentioned St. Louis or the fire or any of it. He told me he was alone. She paused, swallowed hard. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what he did to you. I'm sorry I brought you here without knowing. And I'm sorry that my being sorry doesn't fix anything. Silence settled over the cabin. Outside, a crow called, harsh and lonely. What happens now? Noah's voice was barely audible. It was the question Eleanor had been asking herself all night. The contract she'd signed was legal and binding. These boys were indentured to her for 5 years. She had every right to make them work, to treat them as the hired help she'd intended them to be. But they were also her husband's brothers, which made them her baby's uncles, which made them, what? Family? Could you claim family with people whose existence you'd learned about yesterday, whose brother you'd loved without knowing the worst of what he'd done? I don't know, Eleanor said honestly. The legal answer is you're bound here for 5 years. You work for me, I provide for you, and at the end of that time you're free to go. She rubbed her hand across her face, exhausted. The real answer is I don't know. This is all... I didn't expect this. Neither did we, Lucas said. but some of the rage had leaked out of his voice, leaving something rawer behind. Eleanor stood, moved to the window. The sun had climbed higher now, turning the snow-covered landscape into a blinding expanse of white. Somewhere out there, under 3 feet of frozen ground, Thomas was buried. The man she'd loved, the man who'd lied to her every day of their marriage, by omission, if not commission. "Did you love him?" Lucas's question came from directly behind her. She hadn't heard him move. "Yes." The word came out without hesitation, because it was true. Whatever else Thomas had done, whatever lies he'd told, Eleanor had loved him. "He was good to me. Kind. He worked hard on this ranch, made plans for the future. He was excited about the baby." She turned to face Lucas. "I know that doesn't match who he was to you. I know the man I knew and the brother who left you might as well have been 2 different people. But yes, I loved him." Lucas's jaw worked, emotions flashing across his face too quickly to name. "He wrote to us once, about a year after he left, said he was doing well, that he'd send for us when he got settled." His voice cracked slightly. "We waited. Noah used to ask every day when Thomas was coming back. I kept telling him soon, any day now, he promised." "He never sent another letter," Noah said softly. "I stopped asking eventually." Eleanor's heart broke for them, for these boys who'd waited for a brother who never came, who'd learned that promises meant nothing, that love was conditional and family could be discarded. "I can't change what he did," she said. "I can't go back and make him be the brother you needed. But I can—" She stopped, trying to find the right words. "I can try to do better, going forward, if you're willing to stay." "We don't have a choice." Lucas's voice was bitter again. "The contract—" "Forget the contract," Eleanor cut him off. "I'm asking if you want to stay, not because you're legally bound, not because you're afraid of being sent back to the holding house, but because maybe we all need each other to survive this winter, and maybe we're all we've got." She watched the question land, watched Lucas process it. He looked at Noah, some wordless communication passing between the brothers. "What would be different?" Lucas asked finally. "If we stay by choice instead of contract?" Eleanor thought about it. "Honestly, probably nothing. The work still needs doing. The ranch still needs running. Winter's still coming." She paused. "But maybe it would mean we're partners in this instead of owner and property. Maybe it would mean when spring comes and the baby's born, we figure out what comes next together instead of me deciding for you. And if we want to leave after winter, then you leave." The words hurt to say, but Eleanor forced them out. "I won't hold you here against your will. I won't be like—" She stopped herself. "Like Thomas," Lucas finished for her. "Like Thomas." Another long silence. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, the tick of the clock on the mantel, the settling of logs in the fire. "I need to think about it," Lucas said. "Noah and we need to talk. Take whatever time you need, but while you're thinking, we still have work to do." Eleanor moved toward the door, pulling on her coat. "The livestock need feeding. The firewood won't split itself. And there's a storm coming in tomorrow. I can smell it on the air. We need to be ready." She stepped outside into the cold, not waiting to see if they followed. The barn needed mucking, the fence line needed checking, and dwelling on the wreckage of her marriage wouldn't get any of it done. She was halfway to the barn when she heard footsteps crunching through the snow behind her. Both boys, moving together, that same careful synchronization they'd shown since yesterday. They worked through the morning in near silence. Eleanor showed them where everything was, the tools in the barn, the hay stored in the loft, the chicken coop behind the house, where 4 scraggly hens produced just enough eggs to keep them in breakfast. Lucas asked practical questions about the work. Noah watched and listened and occasionally helped when directed. By noon, Eleanor's back was screaming, and her feet had gone numb in her worn boots. She called a halt, and they trudged back to the cabin for a meal of beans and cornbread. "The fence on the north pasture is failing," Lucas said around a mouthful of food. 3 posts rotted through. It'll need replacing before the snow gets too deep." "I know." Eleanor had been trying not to think about the fence. "I don't have the money for new posts right now. I was hoping it would hold through winter." "Won't. First strong wind, and you'll have cows wandering into the next territory. Lucas frowned. There are some dead trees up in the foothills. We could cut them down, drag them back, set them ourselves. That's 2, maybe 3 days' work in the cold. Better than losing livestock. Eleanor couldn't argue with that. All right, we'll start tomorrow if the weather holds. They ate in silence for a while. Then Noah spoke, his voice still so quiet Eleanor had to lean forward to hear. Did he talk about us? Ever? The question pierced something in Eleanor's chest. She wanted to lie, to give this boy some comfort, but she'd already had enough of lies. No, she said gently. He never mentioned having brothers. I'm sorry. Noah nodded, eyes on his plate. Lucas reached over and gripped his brother's shoulder briefly, a gesture of comfort so automatic it seemed unconscious. Did he talk about anything from before? Lucas asked. St. Louis? Our parents? Anything? He said his parents died when he was young. He never specified how. He said he'd been on his own since then, working his way west. He talked about wanting to build something permanent, to have a family, to put down roots. Eleanor's voice caught. I thought I understood him, thought we wanted the same things. Maybe he did. Lucas's voice was grudging. Want those things, I mean. Maybe he just wanted them without the baggage of the family he already had. It was possible. Eleanor had learned enough about people in her 24 years to know that humans were capable of holding contradictory truths, wanting family while abandoning the one they had, craving belonging while running from connection. There's something else you should know, she said, about the ranch, about why I needed help. She paused, gathering her courage. When Thomas died, I found out he'd taken out a loan. A big one. He used the ranch as collateral. Lucas's eyes sharpened. How big? $800. Lucas whistled low. What did he spend it on? I don't know. The banker said Thomas took it out 6 months before he died, said he had business opportunities. But I never saw evidence of anything. No new equipment, no livestock purchases, nothing. Eleanor's hands clenched around her coffee cup. I think he gambled it away. There was a poker game that used to run at the trading post. I think he lost it all and couldn't figure out how to tell me. When's the loan due? April. Same month the baby comes. And if you can't pay? We lose everything. The bank takes the ranch, the house, the livestock. Everything. Eleanor met his eyes. That's why I needed help. I have to make this place profitable enough by spring to at least make a payment, prove I can keep up with the debt. Otherwise, my baby and I will have nothing. Lucas sat back, processing this. $800. That's more money than most people see in 5 years. I know. And you thought 2 kids from an orphanage could help you save a failing ranch and pay off that kind of debt? I thought it was better than giving up. Eleanor's voice hardened. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I worked hard enough and had help enough, I could pull this off. Was I wrong? The challenge hung in the air. Lucas stared at her for a long moment, then slowly shook his head. No, he said quietly. You weren't wrong. Desperate, maybe, but not wrong. He glanced at Noah, then back to Eleanor. We'll stay, through winter at least. Help you try to save this place. Not because of the contract. Not because of the contract. Lucas's voice was firm. Because Noah and we know what it's like to lose everything. And because maybe... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Maybe Thomas owed us this much. Didn't give it himself, but left it behind for us to claim. It wasn't forgiveness. Eleanor understood that. It was something more complicated, a reckoning with the past, an acceptance of what was owed and what could never be repaid. Thank you, she said simply. They returned to work after lunch. Eleanor showed them the rest of the property, the small vegetable garden now buried under snow, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary and provided their water supply, the stand of pine trees that sheltered the cabin from the worst of the winter winds. As the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, they stood together at the top of the rise looking down at the cabin and barn. It's small, Lucas said. Yes. The cabin's barely weatherproof. Yes. The barn needs a new roof. Yes. And you think we can make this place turn a profit by spring? Eleanor looked at the ranch spread out below them, all 40 acres of frozen ground and broken dreams. I think we don't have a choice but to try. Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then, surprising her, he smiled slightly. Thomas used to say that. Don't have a choice but to try. Usually right before he did something stupid. Sounds like him, Eleanor said, though she'd never heard Thomas say that exact phrase. But she could imagine it, his optimism, his refusal to acknowledge obstacles until they were directly in his path. Come on, Lucas said, turning back toward the cabin. It's getting dark, and that storm you smelled is definitely coming. The air feels wrong. They made their way back down the hill. Inside the cabin, Eleanor started dinner while the boys brought in extra firewood and stacked it by the stove. The routine felt almost normal, almost like they'd been doing this for months instead of just 2 days. Over dinner, they talked about the work ahead, the fence repair, the firewood that would need cutting and splitting, the barn roof that might hold through one more winter if they patched it properly. Practical things, safe topics that didn't touch on Thomas or the past, or the complicated knot of obligation and resentment that tied them together. After the dishes were cleaned, Noah climbed up to the loft while Lucas lingered by the fire. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. The baby. Do you? He stopped, started again. Are you scared? Eleanor thought about lying, putting on a brave face. But Lucas had earned honesty. Terrified. I've never had a baby before. My mother died when I was young, so I don't have her to ask. And the nearest midwife is 4 hours away in good weather. She placed a hand on her belly. I'm scared I'll do it wrong. Scared something will go wrong. Scared I'll fail this child the way... She stopped herself. The way Thomas failed us, Lucas finished. I wasn't going to say that. But you were thinking it. Lucas poked at the fire with the iron. You're not like him, you know. You wouldn't have taken us in if you were. You would have chosen someone easier, someone who didn't come with all this history. I didn't know about the history when I chose you. But you know now, and you're not sending us back. Eleanor couldn't argue with that. No, I'm not. Why? It was a fair question. Eleanor thought about it, trying to find words for something she barely understood herself. Because maybe you're right. Maybe Thomas does owe you this, and maybe I need to know that some good came from our marriage, that it wasn't all built on lies. Lucas nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I don't think he lied about everything. I think he really did want what he told you, a home, a family, all of it. He just wanted it without having to face what he'd done to get it. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No. It's supposed to help you understand that people are complicated, that someone can love you and still be a coward, can build you a home and still be running from the one they left behind. Lucas's voice went quiet. I loved him once. My big brother who took care of us after our parents died. I thought he was the bravest person in the world. Finding out he wasn't, that he was just scared and selfish like everyone else, that hurt worse than being abandoned. Eleanor understood. She was living that same realization now, watching the man she'd loved fracture into someone more complicated, more flawed, more human than the person she'd thought she married. I'm sorry, she said. For both of us. For all of us. Yeah, me too. They sat in silence, watching the fire burn low. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and finding every gap in the walls. The storm Lucas had predicted was rolling in. Better get some sleep, Eleanor said finally. Tomorrow's going to be hard. Lucas climbed to the loft. Eleanor banked the fire and crawled into bed, listening to the wind howl and the boys settle overhead. She thought about Thomas, about the lie their marriage had been built on, about the brothers he'd left behind, and the wife he had left pregnant and alone. But she also thought about the morning ahead, about fence posts that needed setting and firewood that needed cutting and a ranch that needed saving. She thought about Lucas's careful way with his brother and Noah's quiet resilience, and the possibility that maybe, they could build something real out of the wreckage they'd inherited. The baby kicked, hard and insistent, demanding space where there was none to spare. Eleanor placed her hand over the movement, a promise forming in her mind. I won't be like him, she thought. I won't run. I won't abandon. Whatever comes, we face it together. It wasn't much, but it was a start, The storm hit 2 hours before dawn, battering the cabin with wind that sounded like something alive and furious. Eleanor woke to the shriek of it, to the rattle of shutters and the groan of timber straining against the onslaught. She lay in the darkness, one hand pressed protectively over her belly, listening to the world try to tear itself apart outside. A crash from overhead made her bolt upright. She heard scrambling, then Lucas's voice cutting through the wind's howl. "The roof! Part of it's giving way!" Eleanor was out of bed before she'd fully processed the words, pulling on her boots even as Lucas descended the ladder with Noah right behind him. In the firelight, she could see snow beginning to sift through a gap in the loft ceiling, a thin white curtain that would become a flood if the breach widened. "How bad?" she called over the wind. "Bad enough. The north corner looks like the weight of the snow finally broke through." Lucas was already moving toward the door. "We need to get up there, shore it up before the whole thing comes down. In this storm, you'll freeze to death before you fix anything. And we'll all freeze to death if the roof caves in." Lucas grabbed his coat. "I've done this before. Back in Denver, we lived in a tenement that was always falling apart. You learn to patch fast or you don't survive winter." Eleanor wanted to argue, to tell him he was 14 years old and shouldn't have to risk his life to save her falling down cabin. But the snow was coming through faster now, and she could hear the ominous creak of wood overhead giving way by inches. "Tell me what you need," she said instead. They worked in a kind of controlled chaos. Eleanor held the ladder while Lucas climbed onto the roof with rope and canvas tarp, his small frame better suited than hers to navigate the ice-slicked shingles. Noah stood at the base feeding up supplies, nails, boards salvaged from an old wagon bed, anything that might hold against the wind. The storm fought them for every inch, trying to rip the tarp from Lucas's frozen hands, threatening to pitch him off the roof into the darkness below. "Tie it off on the south corner," Eleanor shouted, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "Loop it through the chimney brace." She couldn't see if Lucas heard her, could only watch his shadow move across the roof, trusting that a 14-year-old boy who'd survived abandonment and streets and orphanages knew enough about survival to keep himself alive through this. It took an hour. By the time Lucas climbed back down, his face was blue with cold, his hands so numb he couldn't grip the ladder rungs properly. Eleanor caught him as he half fell the last few feet, steadied him while Noah wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. "Inside," she ordered. "Both of you. Now." In the cabin, Eleanor built up the fire while the boys huddled close to it, shaking with cold that went bone deep. She heated water, made them drink cup after cup of weak tea sweetened with the last of her honey, watched their color slowly return from blue to pale to something approaching human. "That was foolish," she said, when Lucas's teeth finally stopped chattering enough for him to speak. "It worked. You could have died. But I didn't." Lucas held his hands toward the fire, flexing fingers that were still too white. "And the roof's holding. For now." Eleanor wanted to rage at him, wanted to tell him he didn't get to risk himself like that she was responsible for him now and she couldn't bear to lose anyone else. But the words wouldn't come because they both knew the truth. If Lucas hadn't gone up there, they'd all be huddling in the barn right now, watching the cabin collapse under the weight of snow and wind, and a winter that didn't care about fairness or justice or the fragile lives it crushed. "Thank you," she said instead. Lucas met her eyes, and for a moment she saw past his careful walls to the scared boy underneath, the one who'd learned too young that survival meant doing the dangerous thing because the alternative was worse. "You'd have done the same," he said. "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to." They dozed in shifts through the rest of the night, taking turns watching the fire and listening for any sound of the roof giving way again. By the time gray dawn filtered through the shutters, the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a world buried under 3 feet of new snow. Eleanor stood at the window, looking out at drifts that came halfway up the barn door, at a landscape rendered utterly foreign by the storm's violence. "We need to dig out the barn," she said. "The animals will be panicking." It took them most of the morning to carve a path through the snow. Even with all 3 of them working, it was exhausting labor, shoveling, packing, shoveling again as new snow slid down to fill the space they'd cleared. Eleanor's back screamed in protest, and twice she had to stop and catch her breath while the baby pressed against her lungs. "Rest," Lucas said, not unkindly. Noah and I can finish this. I'm fine. You're pregnant and exhausted. Rest. Eleanor wanted to argue, to prove she could work as hard as any hired hand, but her body was making its own argument, and she was learning the hard way that pride wouldn't get her through winter. She retreated to the cabin while the boys finished clearing the barn. Inside, she made herself useful preparing a meal from their dwindling stores. Beans again, cornbread, the last precious scraps of salt pork. She was just pulling the cornbread from the oven when she heard Noah scream. She was out the door and running before conscious thought caught up, slipping in the snow, catching herself, running again. Lucas met her halfway to the barn, his face white with something beyond cold. It's the cow, the brown one. She's down. Eleanor's heart sank. They had 2 cows, one brown, one spotted. The brown one was their best milker, the one Eleanor had been counting on to provide milk through winter and into spring when the baby came. She found the cow in her stall, lying on her side in the straw, sides heaving with the wrong kind of breathing. Eleanor knelt beside her, running practiced hands over flanks that felt too hot, checking eyes that showed too much white. Bloat, she said quietly. She got into something, or the cold stressed her system. Either way. Can you save her? Noah's voice was small, afraid in a way that had nothing to do with the cow and everything to do with what losing her would mean. Eleanor wanted to lie, wanted to promise that everything would be fine, that they'd fix this like they'd fixed the roof. But she'd learned enough about ranching to recognize when an animal was too far gone. I don't know, she said honestly. I can try. She tried. Spent the next 4 hours in that barn, dosing the cow with every remedy she knew. Salts dissolved in warm water, oil to try to break up the gas, gentle massage to encourage movement. Lucas and Noah helped, following her instructions, their faces tight with concentration. But the cow's breathing grew more labored, her eyes more glassy. As sunset painted the snow orange and gold, Eleanor finally had to accept what she'd known since she'd first seen the animal lying in the straw. I'm sorry, she whispered, to the cow and to the boys and to herself. I'm so sorry. The cow died as full darkness fell. Eleanor sat back on her heels, covered in sweat and straw despite the cold, and felt something crack inside her chest. It was just an animal. Just a cow. But it was also their milk supply, their insurance, one of the few valuable assets they had left. Without her, the math of survival shifted in the wrong direction. What do we do now? Lucas asked quietly. We butcher her. Eleanor's voice came out flat, practical, because if she let herself feel the full weight of this loss, she'd break completely. We can't afford to waste the meat. It'll freeze in this cold. Keep us fed through the worst of winter. They worked by lantern light, the grim business of turning a living creature into food. Lucas proved handy with a knife, his cuts clean and efficient in a way that made Eleanor wonder what else he'd had to learn on the streets of Denver. Noah held the lantern and didn't look away, though his face was pale. By the time they finished, it was past midnight. They stumbled back to the cabin, too exhausted for speech, and fell into bed without bothering to wash the blood from their hands. Eleanor lay awake listening to the boys breathing overhead and tried not to calculate how much this setback had cost them. 1 cow dead. 1 cow remaining, who'd need to be bred in spring if they wanted milk next winter. The money they might have gotten from selling the brown cow's calves, gone. The margin for error they'd been operating on, narrowed to nothing. She woke the next morning to find Lucas already up, standing at the window. What is it? She asked, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. Riders coming, 3 of them. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Visitors this far out in winter usually meant trouble. She moved to the window, saw 3 horses picking their way through the snow toward the cabin. As they drew closer, she recognized the lead rider, Samuel Garrett, who owned the big ranch 5 miles east, and 2 of his hands. Stay inside, she told the boys. Let me handle this. She met Garrett on the porch, arms crossed against the cold and against whatever he'd come to say. Mrs. Finch. Garrett touched the brim of his hat. He was a man in his 50s, weathered and hard, the kind who'd carved his ranch out of raw wilderness through sheer, stubborn will. Thought I'd ride over, check you made it through the storm. We're fine, thank you. Garrett's eyes moved past her to the cabin, to the boys visible through the window. Heard you took on some help. News traveled fast, even in winter. Yes, 2 boys from the holding house. That wise? Woman in your condition, alone with strangers? Eleanor kept her voice level. They're not strangers, they're workers. And my condition doesn't make me helpless. Garrett had the grace to look slightly chagrined. Didn't mean offense, just these are hard times. People get desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. If you came to warn me about my own hired help, you've wasted a ride. But actually, I came to make you an offer. Garrett shifted in his saddle. I know Thomas left you in a bind. Heard about the loan from the bank. I'd like to buy your place. Give you a fair price, enough to pay off the debt and have something left over to start fresh somewhere else. The offer hit Eleanor like a physical blow, because it was reasonable, practical. The smart thing to do would be to take Garrett's money, pay off Thomas's debt, and leave this hard land before winter killed her or the bank took everything anyway. How much? She heard herself ask. $500. The land alone is worth more than that. The land, maybe, but the cabin needs work, the barn needs a new roof. You've got debt hanging over it all. Garrett's voice wasn't unkind, just practical. I'm offering you a way out, Eleanor. A way to save yourself and that baby. Behind her, Eleanor heard the cabin door open. Lucas stood in the doorway, Noah behind him, both boys watching with careful, shuttered faces. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Garrett, Eleanor said clearly, but this ranch isn't for sale. Garrett's eyebrows rose. You sure about that? Spring's a long way off. Lot can happen between now and then. I'm sure. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right then. Offer stands if you change your mind. And Eleanor, he paused. You need anything? You send word. I didn't agree with everything Thomas did, but nobody deserves to struggle alone. He turned his horse and rode off, his men following. Eleanor watched them go, her heart pounding, wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. Why didn't you take it? Lucas asked from the doorway. Eleanor turned to face him. Would you have? $500 is more money than we'll see in our entire lives. That's not what I asked. Lucas was quiet for a moment, then slowly he shook his head. No, I wouldn't have taken it. This place, it's all you have. All any of us have. Exactly. Eleanor moved past him into the cabin. So we'd better figure out how to make it work. The days that followed fell into a brutal rhythm. Up before dawn to feed the remaining animals, then out into the cold to work on whatever crisis had emerged overnight. The fence posts Lucas had identified needed replacing. The chicken coop door had blown off in the storm and needed rehinging. The creek was starting to freeze over, which meant hauling water from farther upstream. Every day brought new problems, new emergencies, new tests of their ability to simply survive. But something was shifting between them, subtle as the lengthening of days. Lucas started asking Eleanor's opinion instead of just telling her what needed doing. Noah began speaking more often, his voice still quiet but present, and Eleanor found herself trusting them in ways she hadn't expected, trusting Lucas to make decisions when her back pain got too bad to think clearly, trusting Noah to handle the chickens and gather eggs without supervision. One evening, 3 weeks after the storm, they sat around the table after dinner, too tired to move but not quite ready to climb to bed. Tell me about St. Louis, Eleanor said. Before the fire. What was it like? Lucas's face closed down immediately. Why? Because Thomas never told me anything about his life before. And I want to understand. I want to know where you came from. Lucas was silent for so long Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Then, haltingly, he began to speak. We lived in a row house near the river. Father worked on the docks. Mother took in sewing. His voice was careful, controlled. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Thomas was already grown, talking about heading west to make his fortune. But he stayed, helped support the family. What happened? Eleanor asked gently. Fire started in the building next to ours, spread fast. Everything was wood and old and dry. Mother got Noah out first, then went back for Thomas and me. Father was at work. By the time the fire brigade arrived, it was too late. Lucas's hands clenched on the table. Thomas pulled me out through a window. I was screaming for Mother, but he wouldn't let me go back, held me down while the building burned. Noah made a small sound. Lucas reached over and gripped his brother's hand. Mother died saving us, Noah whispered. Father died 3 days later. Smoke had gotten into his lungs. Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Thomas took care of us after, Lucas continued. Found us a room in a boarding house, got work where he could. For 2 years it was okay. Hard, but okay. His voice hardened. Then he met Catherine Morehouse. Rich girl slumming in the poor part of town, thought it was romantic to be courted by a rough dock worker. Her father found out, put a stop to it, but Thomas, he got obsessed. Started talking about how we deserved better, how he was going to make something of himself and win her back. That's when he left you with the aunt, Eleanor said. Told us it was temporary, that he'd send for us as soon as he got established out west, made enough money to support all of us. Lucas's laugh was bitter. We believed him. What else could we do? We were 8 and 4. We didn't have a choice. Eleanor thought about Thomas, about the man she'd married. Had he really believed he'd send for his brothers? Or had it been a lie from the start, a way to ease his conscience while he abandoned them? The aunt didn't want us, Noah said softly. She made that clear every day. We were mouths to feed, space she didn't have. When she died, I think she was relieved she wouldn't have to deal with us anymore. How long were you on the streets? Eleanor asked. 6 months. Lucas's jaw tightened. We did what we had to. Begged. Stole sometimes. I found work when I could, but nobody wants to hire a 12-year-old. They'd rather hire grown men who can work longer, harder. Noah was too young to work anywhere legal. I picked pockets, Noah admitted, his voice barely audible. Lucas taught me, said it was the only way we'd eat. Eleanor should have been shocked, should have been appalled that these boys had turned to crime, but all she felt was a deep, aching sadness for the children who'd been forced to choose between starvation and theft. That's when they caught us, Lucas said. Noah got sloppy, tried to lift a wallet from a policeman's wife. They rounded us up, sent us to the holding house. He met Eleanor's eyes. We figured Thomas was dead. It was the only explanation that made sense. Because surely if he was alive, if he was out here living in a cabin with a wife, he would have come back for us, right? The question hung in the air, unanswered, because they all knew the truth. Thomas hadn't come back. Not because he was dead, but because he'd chosen not to. I think he was ashamed, Eleanor said quietly. I think he built this new life and couldn't figure out how to fit you into it without admitting what he'd done. And the longer he waited, the harder it became. So he just never did. Lucas's voice was flat. So he never did. They sat in silence, the weight of Thomas's choices pressing down on all of them. Eleanor thought about the man she'd loved, trying to reconcile him with the brother who'd abandoned these boys. Both versions were true. Both versions were Thomas, and both versions had left wreckage behind. He wasn't all bad, she said finally. He could be kind, thoughtful. He made me laugh. When I told him about the baby, he cried, said it was the best thing that ever happened to him. She paused. But he was also a coward, and I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, that you paid the price for his cowardice. Lucas nodded slowly. Thank you for saying that. It doesn't fix anything. No, but it helps. The conversation shifted to safer topics after that. Plans for spring planting, speculation about whether the remaining cow was pregnant, discussion of what needed fixing before the next storm hit. But something had shifted. Some wall had come down, leaving them raw and exposed, but also perhaps more honest with each other than they'd been before. That night, Eleanor lay in bed listening to the boys settle overhead and realized something that should have terrified her, but instead felt like relief. She cared about them, not just as workers or as her husband's abandoned brothers, but as themselves. Lucas with his fierce protectiveness and his hard-won survival skills. Noah with his quiet resilience and his careful observations. They were becoming something more than hired help, something more than obligation. They were becoming hers, and she was becoming theirs. The thought should have been impossible. They'd known each other barely a month. They were bound together by the worst kind of circumstances, death and debt and deception. But Eleanor had learned that family wasn't always about blood or time or circumstance. Sometimes it was about who showed up when everything fell apart, who stayed when leaving would be easier. who chose, again and again, to face the hard things together. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters and testing the patch on the roof. But the patch held. The cabin stayed warm. And for tonight, that was enough. February came in hard and mean, with temperatures that dropped so low the water in the wash basin froze solid overnight. Eleanor woke one morning to find ice crystals forming on the inside of the windows, her breath visible even under the quilts. The baby had dropped lower in her belly, a constant pressure that made walking difficult and sleeping nearly impossible. She was attempting to get out of bed when pain lanced through her lower back, sharp enough to make her gasp. She gripped the bed frame, breathing through it, telling herself it was just the weight of the baby, just her body adjusting to the changes. Nothing to worry about yet. "You all right?" Lucas's voice came from the ladder. He'd started checking on her in the mornings, a habit that had formed gradually over the past weeks. "Fine. Just stiff." Eleanor forced herself to stand straight, refused to let him see how much it hurt. But Lucas's eyes were too sharp, had learned too much about reading people during his years of survival. "You're in pain." "I'm pregnant. Pain comes with the territory." "How much longer?" Eleanor did the mental calculation. 6 weeks? Maybe 8 if the baby decides to be stubborn. "That's not long." "No." Eleanor moved to the stove, started building up the fire from last night's coals. "Which means we need to be ready. I need you to ride to town tomorrow. Talk to Mrs. Patterson. She's the closest thing we have to a midwife around here." Lucas nodded. "What do I tell her?" "That the baby will likely come in late March or early April. That I'll need her here when my time comes. And that I can pay her—" Eleanor paused, doing the grim arithmetic in her head. "I can pay her $10. It was money they didn't have, money that would come from selling something they couldn't afford to lose. But a baby born without help in a frontier cabin had a way of turning into 2 graves instead of 1 new life, and Eleanor refused to let that happen. The morning was spent on the endless work of winter survival. Lucas and Noah hauled water from the creek, now frozen so solid they had to break through 6 inches of ice to reach the flow beneath. Eleanor tried to help but found herself stopping every few minutes to catch her breath, to wait for the cramping in her belly to ease. "Rest," Lucas ordered, taking the bucket from her hands. "Noah and I can handle this." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to prove she was still capable, still pulling her weight, but her body was making its own arguments, and she was learning the hard way that stubbornness wouldn't carry her through labor if she exhausted herself before it even began. She retreated to the cabin and began taking inventory of their supplies. The butchered cow had provided meat, but their flour was running low, their salt nearly gone. The remaining cow was pregnant but wouldn't give birth until spring, which meant no fresh milk for weeks yet. The chickens had stopped laying in the cold, and their store of eggs had dwindled to nothing. Eleanor was staring at the nearly empty cupboard when she felt it, a sudden gush of warmth between her legs, then a pain that seized her entire belly and squeezed like a vice. Too early. The thought cut through the pain with crystal clarity. The baby was coming too early. She managed to make it to the door, managed to call out for Lucas before another contraction hit, this one strong enough to drop her to her knees. Lucas was there in seconds, Noah right behind him. "What's wrong? What's happening?" "The baby." Eleanor gritted the words out between clenched teeth. "It's coming. Now." "But you said 6 weeks. I know what I said." The contraction eased slightly, giving her enough breath to think. "Lucas, you need to ride for Mrs. Patterson, right now. Tell her it started." "That's 4 hours there and 4 hours back in good weather. I'll never make it in time." Eleanor knew he was right, knew that by the time he brought help, this would be over one way or another. But she needed him gone because she needed Noah gone, because she couldn't let these boys see her bleed and scream and possibly die the way women did in childbirth when things went wrong. "Try anyway," she managed. "Please." Lucas looked at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw the war in his eyes, the instinct to obey orders fighting against the knowledge that leaving her now might mean coming back to find her dead. Then his jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. "No," he said, "I'm not leaving you." "Lucas? No." His voice was firm, adult in a way that 14-year-old boys shouldn't have to be. Noah, run to the barn. There's clean cloth in the storage chest, and there should be some old sheets we can boil. Bring all of it, and bring the whiskey from the top shelf, the bottle Thomas kept hidden. Noah ran. Lucas helped Eleanor to the bed, his hands steady despite the fear in his eyes. Have you ever done this before? Eleanor asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it anyway. No, but I've seen it. In Denver, in the tenement, women had babies all the time. Lucas's voice was calmer than his face. Most of them lived through it. Most, Eleanor repeated, catching the word he'd left unsaid. You'll live through it. Lucas said it like a command, like he could make it true through sheer force of will. You're stubborn enough. Another contraction hit, and Eleanor stopped being able to think about anything except breathing through the pain. Time became strange, unmeasurable. She was aware of Lucas and Noah moving around her, of cloth being boiled on the stove, of whiskey being pressed to her lips. She was aware of the pain coming in waves that grew closer together, stronger, until there was no space between them to catch her breath. Something's wrong. She heard herself say it during a brief respite. The pain, it shouldn't be this bad, this fast. Lucas's face was white but determined. What do I need to do? I don't know. Eleanor wanted to scream with frustration and fear. She'd prepared as much as any woman could for childbirth, had talked to other mothers, had read the few books available on the subject, but none of it had prepared her for this, for pain that felt like her body was trying to tear itself apart from the inside. The baby might be turned wrong, she gasped out. Breech, or sideways, if it is— Tell me what to do, Lucas interrupted. Step by step, I'll do it. Eleanor looked at this boy who wasn't really a boy anymore, who'd survived abandonment in streets and orphanages, who'd climbed onto a roof in a blizzard to save a cabin that wasn't even his. And she made a choice to trust him with the life she carried, because she had no other option. You'll need to check, feel for the baby's position. The words came out between ragged breaths. If you can feel the head, that's good. Anything else? She couldn't finish the sentence because another contraction hit, stronger than before, and she felt something shift inside her, a terrible wrongness that made her cry out. Lucas's hands were gentle but firm as he checked, his face a mask of concentration. When he looked up, his eyes held knowledge no 14-year-old should have to carry. I feel feet, he said quietly. The baby's coming feet first. Breech. The word carried weight, carried danger. Eleanor had heard the stories. Babies born breech who never drew breath, mothers who bled out because the birth went wrong. She'd always told herself it wouldn't happen to her, that her baby would come head first and healthy and everything would be fine. You need to turn it. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. From the outside, press on my belly, try to shift the baby around. Lucas looked at Noah, who stood white-faced in the corner. Boil more water and bring me those clean cloths. For the next hour, Lucas worked with a focus and determination that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. His hands pressed and kneaded at her swollen belly, trying to coax the baby into turning, into finding the right position. Eleanor bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming, tasted blood where she'd bitten through her own lip. It's moving. Lucas's voice held cautious hope. I think, yes, it's turning. Keep breathing. Just keep breathing. But the baby didn't turn enough, or turned back, or was too stubborn to cooperate. When the next contraction came, Eleanor felt the unstoppable urge to push, felt her body taking over despite her mind screaming that it was too soon. The baby wasn't in position. This was going to go wrong. I have to push, she gasped. Not yet. I can't stop it. Lucas, I can't. Then push. Lucas's voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who decided that panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Push and I'll guide the baby out. We can do this. Eleanor pushed and screamed and pushed again. She was aware of Lucas's voice, calm and encouraging, telling her she was doing well, telling her to breathe, telling her the baby was coming. She was aware of Noah hovering nearby, his small hands bringing clean cloths, fresh water, whatever Lucas needed. She was aware of pain beyond anything she'd imagined possible. And then, finally, blessedly, she felt the baby slip free in a rush of fluid and relief. Silence. Terrible, absolute silence. Why isn't it crying? Eleanor tried to sit up, panic cutting through exhaustion. Lucas, why isn't the baby crying? She saw Lucas's face, saw his hands working, saw him tip the baby upside down and strike its back firmly. Once, twice, then a third time, and then a sound, a weak mewling cry that strengthened into a full-throated wail. It's a girl! Lucas's voice was shaking now, all his careful control fracturing. You have a daughter. He placed the baby on Eleanor's chest, this tiny, furious creature covered in blood and vernix and absolutely perfect. Eleanor's hands came up automatically, cradling her daughter, feeling the impossible reality of this life she'd carried and brought into the world. Hello, she whispered. Hello, little one. The baby stopped crying at the sound of her voice, dark eyes struggling to focus. She had Thomas's hair, dark and thick, but her eyes were Eleanor's, or would be when they settled into their permanent color, and her chin, that stubborn little chin, that was all her own. She's beautiful. Noah's voice came from somewhere to Eleanor's left, full of wonder. She is. Eleanor couldn't stop looking at her daughter, couldn't stop marveling at the tiny fingers that gripped her thumb with surprising strength. She really is. Lucas finished the work of cutting and tying the cord, of delivering the afterbirth, of cleaning up with an efficiency that spoke of someone who'd learned to handle crisis without falling apart. When he was done, he sat back on his heels, covered in blood and sweat, looking like he'd aged a decade in the last few hours. Thank you. Eleanor met his eyes, tried to put everything she felt into those 2 words. You saved us. Both of us. Lucas nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Eleanor saw his hands shaking, saw the delayed shock hitting him now that the emergency was over. Noah, heat some soup, she said gently. And make your brother eat something. He's earned it. The next hours passed in a haze of exhaustion and wonder. Eleanor nursed her daughter for the first time, marveling at how instinctively the baby knew what to do. Lucas and Noah took turns watching over them, bringing water and food, stoking the fire, doing all the small tasks that kept the cabin running. As darkness fell, Eleanor finally allowed herself to sleep, her daughter tucked safely against her side. She woke sometime in the night to find Lucas sitting in the chair beside her bed, keeping watch. You should sleep, she murmured. I will. Just wanted to make sure you were both all right. Eleanor looked at him in the firelight, this boy who'd become so much more than hired help. What you did today was what needed doing. It was more than that. You were... She paused, searching for the right words. You were brave and steady, and I don't know what I would have done without you. Lucas was quiet for a moment. When Noah and I were on the streets, I promised him I'd keep him safe, that I'd do whatever it took to survive, to take care of him. His voice went soft. Today felt like that, like I was taking care of family. The word hung in the air between them. Family. Not hired help. Not indentured workers. Not even her late husband's abandoned brothers. Family. Is that what we are now? Eleanor asked. Family? Lucas looked at her, then at the baby sleeping peacefully, then back to Eleanor. I think maybe we always were. We just didn't know it yet. Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes, the good kind that came from gratitude and relief and the overwhelming emotion of becoming a mother while simultaneously gaining 2 sons she hadn't expected. She needs a name, Lucas said. Have you decided? Eleanor had thought about names during her pregnancy, had made lists and discussed options with Thomas before he died. But none of those names felt right now, in this moment, with this particular daughter who'd come early and fierce and determined to survive. Grace, she said. Her name is Grace. Because that's what this was. Grace. Unearned, unexpected, the kind of mercy that came when you'd given up expecting it. Grace that had brought her 2 boys who knew how to survive. Grace that had carried her through a birth that should have killed her. Grace that had given her a daughter when she'd lost everything else. Grace Finch, Lucas tried the name out. I like it. Grace Finch Ashford, Eleanor corrected him gently. Because you and Noah are part of this family too, and I want her to carry that. Want her to know she has brothers who fought to bring her into this world. Lucas's breath caught. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might cry, but he just nodded, swallowing hard against emotion too big for words. Over the next days, they settled into a new rhythm. Eleanor was confined to bed, her body needing time to heal from the trauma of birth. Lucas and Noah took over everything: the cooking, the cleaning, the endless work of keeping the animals fed and the cabin warm. They took turns holding Grace, awkward at first but quickly growing confident, learning to soothe her when she cried and change her when she needed it. Eleanor watched them with her daughter and felt something shift in her understanding of what family meant. She thought family was blood and marriage, the conventional structures society dictated. But watching Lucas rock Grace to sleep while humming an old lullaby he remembered from childhood, watching Noah fetch warm water to clean her without being asked, she understood that family was something you built from whatever materials you had: love and necessity, choice and circumstance, blood and everything beyond it. A week after Grace's birth, Eleanor was finally strong enough to sit at the table for meals. They were eating a simple dinner of beans and cornbread when Lucas spoke. "We need to talk about the loan." Eleanor had been trying not to think about it, trying to focus on recovery and her daughter and getting through each day. But the reality hadn't changed. The loan was due in April. They were deeper in debt than ever, and now they had another mouth to feed. "I know," she said quietly. "The cow will calve in a few weeks. That'll give us milk again, and eventually we can sell the calf." Lucas was ticking through their assets the way he'd learned to calculate survival. "We have the butchered meat, which saves us buying food. And when spring comes, we can plant the fields, maybe get a crop in." "It won't be enough." Eleanor said what they were all thinking. "Even if everything goes perfectly, we won't make enough by April to pay what we owe. Then we need to make a partial payment. Show the bank we're trying." Lucas's jaw set in that stubborn line. "Garrett offered you $500 for the ranch. What if we offer the bank half that as a down payment, negotiate terms for the rest?" "With what money? We don't have $250. "No, but we have something else." Lucas met her eyes. "We have labor. We can offer to work for the bank, for Garrett, for anyone who'll hire us. Take on jobs through spring and summer, put every penny toward the debt." It was a plan born of desperation, the kind of calculation people made when they had nothing left to lose. But it was also practical, achievable, the only real option they had. "All right," Eleanor said. "When I'm strong enough, we'll ride to town. Talk to the bank, see what terms we can negotiate." But fate had other plans. 2 days later, Noah woke with a fever. By afternoon, his skin was burning to the touch, and he was coughing hard enough to bring up blood. Pneumonia. Eleanor recognized it with the terrible certainty of someone who'd seen it before. He needs medicine. Real medicine, not just home remedies. Lucas's face went white. "How do we get it?" "The doctor in town, but that's 8 hours round trip and it'll cost money we don't have." "I'll go." Lucas was already pulling on his coat. "I'll get the medicine and I'll get the doctor to come if I have to drag him here myself." "Lucas, we can't afford—" "I don't care." Lucas's voice was fierce. "He's my brother. I'm not losing him, not after everything." Eleanor understood. Understood that for Lucas, losing Noah would be losing the last piece of his original family, the last connection to the life before Thomas's abandonment had shattered everything. She understood because she'd felt the same fierce protectiveness when Grace was born, that absolute refusal to accept loss. "Take what's left of the silver candlesticks," she said. "Sell them if you have to. Get whatever Noah needs." Lucas rode out within the hour, pushing the horse hard despite the cold. Eleanor was left with Grace and a feverish Noah, trying to keep him comfortable while terror clawed at her chest. She'd already lost Thomas. She'd almost lost Grace. She couldn't bear to lose Noah too, couldn't bear to see that light go out of Lucas's eyes if his brother died. She spent the night alternating between nursing Grace and bathing Noah's burning skin with cool water, praying to forces she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, making bargains with the universe that she had no power to keep. Dawn came gray and cold. Noah's fever had climbed higher. His breathing was shallow, labored. Eleanor held his hand and told him stories about his brother, about how Lucas had climbed a roof in a blizzard, about how he delivered Grace without flinching, about how he loved Noah more than anything in the world. "You have to hold on," she whispered. "Lucas is coming back. He's bringing medicine. You just have to hold on a little longer." Mid-morning, she heard hoofbeats. Lucas burst through the door with a gray-haired man in tow, Dr. Morrison, who Eleanor had met once in town. "Here." The doctor moved immediately to Noah's side, opening his bag and pulling out bottles and instruments. "How long has he been like this?" 2 days. The fever started suddenly. Dr. Morrison worked quickly, listening to Noah's lungs, checking his pulse, finally administering medicine from a dark brown bottle. "Pneumonia, as you suspected. Caught it early, though. This should bring the fever down, help with the breathing." They waited. Lucas sat beside his brother, holding his hand, whispering things too low for Eleanor to hear. Eleanor held Grace and watched, hoping, praying. By evening, the fever broke. Noah's breathing eased. He opened his eyes and looked at Lucas with recognition. "You came back," he whispered. "Always," Lucas said. "I'll always come back for you." Dr. Morrison stayed the night, monitoring Noah's recovery. In the morning, he pronounced the boy out of danger as long as he rested and continued the medicine. "What do I owe you?" Eleanor asked, dreading the answer. Dr. Morrison looked at her, at the small cabin and the obvious poverty, at Lucas still sitting vigil beside his brother. "The medicine is $2? As for my services," he paused, "I heard what this boy did, delivering a breech baby on his own, saving both mother and child. That takes courage and quick thinking. Consider my visit payment for the education I'm going to use teaching other midwives what's possible when someone refuses to give up." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. "Thank you." After the doctor left, they sat together in the quiet cabin, Eleanor with Grace, Lucas with Noah, the four of them together in the warmth and safety they'd built from nothing. Outside, February was giving way to March. Spring was coming, and with it, the reckoning with the bank, with Thomas's debt, with everything they still had to face. But for now, in this moment, they were alive. They were together. And they were family in the way that mattered most. Not because they shared blood or legal documents, but because they'd chosen each other again and again when it would have been easier to walk away. March brought the first hints of thaw, snow melting into rivulets that cut paths through the remaining drifts, ice breaking up on the creek with sounds like gunshots in the quiet mornings. Eleanor stood at the window with Grace asleep against her shoulder, watching Lucas and Noah work on repairing the barn roof. Noah had recovered fully from the pneumonia, though he moved with more caution now, as if he'd learned that his body could betray him. The loan payment was due in 3 weeks. Eleanor had done the calculations so many times she could recite them in her sleep. They had $43 saved from selling Thomas's tools and her remaining possessions. The bank wanted $800. Even with the most optimistic projections for spring planning, they'd be lucky to make another $100 before the payment came due. It wasn't enough. Would never be enough. Eleanor had sent a letter to the bank 2 weeks ago, requesting a meeting to discuss payment terms. She'd received a reply yesterday, terse and formal. Mr. Hutchins, the bank manager, would arrive on March 28th to discuss the matter. 3 days before the loan came due, she was still staring out the window when she heard a rider approaching. Samuel Garrett again, this time alone. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, Grace still in her arms. Garrett dismounted, removed his hat. "Mrs. Finch, heard you had the baby. Congratulations." "Thank you." Garrett's eyes moved to Lucas and Noah on the barn roof, then back to Eleanor. "Also heard one of your boys took sick. Glad to see he's recovered." News traveled in strange ways out here, carried by traveling merchants and ranch hands and the invisible network of people who paid attention to their neighbors' struggles. Eleanor wasn't sure if she should be grateful for the concern or resentful of the scrutiny. "What can I do for you, Mr. Garrett?" "I'll be direct. I know the loan's coming due. I know you're nowhere near being able to pay it." Garrett's voice wasn't unkind. "My offer still stands. $500 for the ranch. It's enough to clear most of the debt and give you a fresh start." Eleanor looked down at Grace, at her daughter's perfect sleeping face, then back at Garrett. "And what happens to us after? Where do we go?" "That's up to you. But Eleanor," Garrett's voice softened. This land is hard. It breaks strong men. You're a widow with a newborn and two orphan boys who shouldn't be your responsibility. Nobody would blame you for taking the smart option." "The smart option," Eleanor repeated. "Funny how the smart option always seems to involve giving up." "It's not giving up. It's surviving. By losing everything Thomas built, everything we've fought to keep?" Eleanor shook her head. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Garrett, but my answer is still no." Garrett studied her for a long moment. "You're stubborn. Thomas was stubborn too. Look where it got him." The words stung because they were true. Thomas's stubborn optimism, his refusal to acknowledge reality until it was too late, had left Eleanor buried in debt and facing impossible choices. "Maybe," Eleanor said quietly, "but stubborn is all I've got left. So I'm going to see this through." After Garrett left, Eleanor found Lucas in the barn, oiling the harness leather. He looked up when she entered, read something in her face. "Garrett came back with his offer," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "You should take it." Eleanor blinked, surprised. "What?" Lucas set down the leather, wiped his hands on his pants. $500. That clears most of the debt, gives you enough to find a place in town. Maybe start over somewhere easier. Somewhere you're not killing yourself trying to make 40 acres of stubborn ground produce enough to survive. "I thought you wanted to stay here. You said this place was all we had." I said that before Grace was born, before Noah almost died." Lucas's voice was carefully controlled. "This place, it's too hard, Eleanor. Too much work for too little return. And now you've got a baby to think about. What happens next winter when the roof caves in again? Or the year after when another cow dies? How long do you keep fighting before it kills you?" Eleanor heard the fear underneath his words, the terror of someone who'd already lost everyone who mattered and couldn't bear to lose anyone else. "I can't," she said simply. "I can't just give up, not after everything." "It's not giving up." "Yes, it is." Eleanor's voice was firm. "It's exactly that, and I won't do it. I won't teach Grace that when things get hard, you walk away. I won't teach you and Noah that fighting for something is pointless. Because that's what Thomas taught you, isn't it? That people leave when things get difficult? That promises don't mean anything?" Lucas flinched as if she'd struck him. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, softer now. "But we've come too far to quit now. The loan meeting is in 3 days. Let me see what terms we can negotiate. If the bank won't work with us, then we'll figure out our next step. But I need to try." Lucas was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. "All right. But Eleanor, if this doesn't work, if the bank takes the ranch anyway, promise me you won't blame yourself. Some things can't be fixed no matter how hard you fight." "I promise," Eleanor said, though she wasn't sure she could keep it. The next 3 days passed in a blur of anxious preparation. Eleanor rehearsed her arguments, practiced her negotiating points, tried to present herself as a competent businesswoman instead of a desperate widow. Lucas and Noah worked double time on repairs, trying to make the ranch look as prosperous as possible for the banker's visit. March 28th dawned clear and cold. Eleanor dressed in her best remaining dress, one she'd let out to accommodate her post-pregnancy body. She fed Grace, settled her with Noah, who'd proven surprisingly adept at soothing the baby, and waited on the porch with Lucas for Mr. Hutchins to arrive. The banker came at noon, riding in a covered buggy that seemed absurdly formal for the rough frontier road. He was a thin man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the pinched expression of someone perpetually disappointed by humanity. "Mrs. Finch," he greeted her with a curt nod. "Shall we discuss your situation?" Eleanor led him inside, offered coffee that he declined. They sat at the table, Eleanor, Lucas, and Mr. Hutchins, with the weight of $800 in debt hanging between them. "I'll be frank," Hutchins began, pulling papers from his case. "Your husband took out this loan 6 months before his death. The terms were clear. Full payment due 1 year from signing, with the property as collateral. That payment is now due in 3 days. I understand the terms, Mr. Hutchins. I'm here to discuss an extension or a payment plan." Hutchins' eyebrows rose. "Based on what collateral? The ranch is already pledged against the original loan. You have no other assets of value. I have labor. I have 2 capable workers and myself. We can take on additional jobs, put every penny toward the debt. That's admirable, Mrs. Finch, but impractical. Even working full-time, you'd need years to pay off this amount. The bank isn't in the business of extended charity. Lucas spoke up, his voice steady. What if we made a substantial down payment? Proved we're serious about meeting our obligations. Hutchins looked at Lucas as if noticing him for the first time. How substantial? $200 by the end of the week. Eleanor's head snapped toward Lucas. They didn't have $200. They barely had 50. But Lucas continued, his voice calm. 200 down, then monthly payments of $25. We'd have the full amount paid off in 2 years. Where exactly would you get $200 in 3 days? Hutchins' tone was skeptical. We have assets we can liquidate. Livestock, equipment, personal items. Lucas met the banker's eyes with a confidence Eleanor didn't feel. But we need to know the bank will accept those terms before we sell. Hutchins was silent, calculating. Eleanor could see him weighing the options. Take the ranch now and deal with the hassle of selling it, or accept a payment plan from a widow who might default in 6 months anyway. $150 down, Hutchins said finally. $30 monthly for 20 months. Miss a single payment, and the full amount becomes due immediately. Those are my terms. Eleanor did the math in her head. $30 a month was more than they could reliably make, especially in winter. But it was also a chance, a foothold, a way forward that didn't involve losing everything immediately. We'll take it, she said before Lucas could respond. Hutchins produced a contract, had Eleanor sign it with Lucas as witness. When the banker finally left, Eleanor turned to Lucas with a mixture of gratitude and fury. Where are we going to get $150 in 3 days? Lucas's confidence faltered slightly. I'm working on that. Working on it? Lucas, we just committed to terms we can't meet. If we don't come up with the money, we'll come up with it. Lucas's jaw set in that stubborn line. I have an idea. Just trust me. Eleanor wanted to shake him, wanted to demand answers. But she'd learned over the past months that Lucas didn't make promises he couldn't keep. If he said he had a plan, she had to trust him. That evening, Lucas rode out alone, refusing to say where he was going. He returned after dark, looking exhausted but determined. I talked to Garrett, he said. Asked him if his offer was still open. Eleanor's heart sank. Lucas, no, I told him, not for the whole ranch, for the north pasture, 20 acres. Lucas met her eyes. He'll pay $200 for it. Good grazing land adjacent to his property. He's been wanting to expand in that direction anyway. That's half our land. It's the half we weren't going to be able to plant this year anyway. And it saves the rest. Lucas's voice was gentle. Eleanor, we can rebuild. We can make 20 acres work. But we can't make anything work if the bank takes it all. Eleanor thought about the north pasture, about the hours she and Thomas had spent walking that land, planning what they'd do with it. Thought about giving away half of everything they'd worked for. But she also thought about Grace sleeping peacefully in her cradle, about Noah, who'd almost died because they couldn't afford proper medicine, about Lucas, who'd kept them all alive through sheer determination. All right, she said quietly. Sell it. The transaction happened 2 days later. Garrett arrived with cash, counted out $200 in bills and coins. Eleanor signed the deed transfer with a hand that wanted to shake but didn't. When Garrett left, they had enough for the down payment plus a small buffer for supplies. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like surrender. We're going to be all right, Lucas said, as if reading her thoughts. 20 acres is enough. We'll plant wheat in the south fields, keep the garden, raise the livestock we can manage. We'll make this work. Over the next weeks, they threw themselves into spring work with renewed determination. Lucas and Noah plowed the south fields while Eleanor managed the garden and cared for Grace. The remaining cow calved successfully, giving them fresh milk and eventually a calf they could sell. The chickens started laying again. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. The first payment to the bank came due in April. They made it with $3 to spare. The second payment in May required selling the calf earlier than planned, but they made it. June's payment came from vegetables Eleanor sold at the trading post and odd jobs Lucas took repairing fences for neighboring ranches. It was hard work, relentless and exhausting. But it was also honest work, building something real instead of watching it crumble. And somewhere in the midst of the struggle, they stopped being a widow and two orphan boys bound together by desperation. They became a family. One evening in July, Eleanor found Lucas sitting on the porch, staring at the sunset. She settled beside him, Grace drowsy in her arms. "Penny for your thoughts," she said. Lucas was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about Thomas, about how angry I was when I found out he was your husband, how much I hated him for leaving us, for building this life while Noah and I were on the streets." Eleanor waited, sensing there was more. "But I think I understand now. A little, anyway." Lucas's voice was thoughtful. He was scared. Scared of failing, scared of not being enough, scared of facing what he'd done. So he ran, built something new and convinced himself the past didn't matter. He paused. "I'm not saying it was right, it wasn't, but I understand being scared." "We're all scared sometimes," Eleanor said gently. "The difference is what we do with that fear. Thomas let it make him a coward. You let it make you brave." Lucas looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "I don't feel brave. Brave people rarely do. They just do what needs doing and call it survival." Eleanor shifted Grace to her other arm. "You've held this family together, Lucas. Everything we've accomplished, we did it because you refused to give up. That's not just survival, that's courage." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. In the distance, Noah was bringing the cows in for the evening, singing some made-up song that made the animals follow him like he was the Pied Piper. "Do you ever think about what comes after?" Lucas asked. "After we pay off the loan, I mean. What happens then?" Eleanor had thought about it, though she'd been afraid to voice it aloud. "I think we keep building. Maybe add a room onto the cabin. You and Noah are getting too big for the loft. Plant more of the garden. See about getting another cow or two." She paused. "Why? Are you thinking about leaving?" "No." Lucas's answer was immediate, firm. "I just wanted to make sure you weren't planning to kick us out once the debt's paid and we're not useful anymore." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Lucas Ashford, you listen to me. You and Noah stopped being hired help about 5 minutes after you arrived here. You're my sons, both of you. Not because some paper says so, but because that's what you are. And if you think I'm letting you go anywhere, you're out of your mind." Lucas's eyes went bright with unshed tears. "Even though we're Thomas's brothers? Even though we're a reminder of everything he did wrong?" "Especially because of that." Eleanor's voice was fierce. "You're proof that something good came from his life, that he left behind people worth knowing, worth loving. That's his real legacy, not the debt or the lies, but you." Lucas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. After a moment, Eleanor stood, offering her free hand to help him up. "Come on, Noah's probably wondering where we are, and there's stew that needs eating before it gets cold." They walked inside together, to where Noah had already set the table and was making faces at Grace to make her smile, to warmth and lamplight and the ordinary domestic chaos of family. The months passed. August brought the first successful wheat harvest from their reduced acreage, enough to make the payment with some left over for flour and supplies. September saw Eleanor teaching Noah his letters, while Lucas learned basic bookkeeping so he could help track their expenses. October brought an early frost that killed part of the garden but spared the root vegetables they'd need for winter. November marked 1 year since Eleanor had first brought Lucas and Noah home. They celebrated with a special dinner, roasted chicken from one of their older hens, bread made with white flour instead of cornmeal, and a pie made from the last of the preserved berries. "To survival," Eleanor toasted with her cup of water. "To family," Lucas corrected, raising his own cup. They drank, and Eleanor felt the truth of it settle into her bones. This was family, messy and complicated and forged in hardship, but real in a way her marriage to Thomas never quite had been. Winter came again, but this time they were ready. The roof was solid, the wood supply ample, the food stores adequate. Grace was walking now, stumbling around the cabin on chubby legs while Lucas and Noah took turns catching her before she fell. She called them both Baba, unable to distinguish between brothers, and they both responded as if it was their name. In February, Eleanor made the final payment on the loan. She rode to town with Lucas, walked into the bank with $120, the last installment on Thomas's debt. Mr. Hutchins counted it out, made a notation in his ledger, then handed Eleanor a receipt marked "Paid in Full." "Congratulations, Mrs. Finch. The property is now clear of all encumbrances." His tone suggested he was surprised they'd actually done it. Eleanor took the receipt, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her coat pocket. "Thank you, Mr. Hutchins." Outside the bank, she and Lucas stood in the winter sunshine, breathing in the cold air and the impossible reality of freedom from debt. "We did it," Lucas said, sounding dazed. "We did." Eleanor looked at this boy who'd become a man over the past year, who delivered her baby and saved his brother and kept them all alive through determination and intelligence and sheer stubborn will. "We actually did it." They rode home in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Noah was waiting on the porch with Grace in his arms. "Well?" he called out. Eleanor held up the receipt. "It's done. The ranch is ours, free and clear." Noah's face broke into a grin, the first truly unguarded smile Eleanor had seen from him. He set Grace down carefully and ran to Lucas, throwing his arms around his brother in a hug that spoke of shared relief and joy, and the knowledge that they'd survived something that should have broken them. That night, after the celebration dinner, and after Grace was asleep, Eleanor found herself standing at Thomas's grave. She hadn't visited it since before Grace was born, had been too angry and too busy and too consumed with survival to spare energy for grief. The marker was simple, just his name and dates, carved into a wooden cross that would eventually rot and return to the earth. Looking at it now, Eleanor felt a complicated tangle of emotions. Anger at his lies, grief for the man she'd thought she married, gratitude for the life he'd inadvertently given her. "I paid it off," she said aloud to the cold air and the silent grave. "Your debt, your mess, we paid it all off." She paused. "Lucas and Noah, your brothers that you abandoned, they saved me, saved Grace, saved everything you left behind when you died." The wind rustled through the pine trees, carrying the scent of snow and earth and the promise of spring to come. "I've forgiven you," Eleanor continued, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Not because what you did was right, but because holding on to that anger was like carrying around a stone in my chest, and I'm tired of carrying things that don't serve me anymore." She touched the wooden cross lightly. "I hope wherever you are, you know that something good came from your life, that your brothers turned out to be better men than you were, that your daughter will grow up knowing what real family looks like." She turned to walk back to the cabin and found Lucas standing a few yards away, respectful of her moment but close enough that she knew he'd heard. "How long have you been there?" she asked. "Long enough." Lucas moved to stand beside her, looking down at his brother's grave. "Do you think he would have been proud of what we did?" Eleanor thought about it, really thought about it. "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe he would have been ashamed that it took his death for his brothers to get what they deserved. A home, a family, a chance." She looked at Lucas. "Does it matter?" "No," Lucas said after a moment. "I guess it doesn't." They stood together in the growing darkness, two people bound by loss and choice and the 1,000 small decisions that had brought them to this moment. "I used to dream about this," Lucas said quietly. "When Noah and I were on the streets, I'd imagine Thomas coming back for us. Picture him saying he was sorry, that he'd made a mistake, that he wanted us with him." His voice was steady, matter of fact. "But this, what we have now, it's better than any dream, because we chose it, all of us. We chose to stay, to fight, to be family. Nobody forced us. Nobody guilted us. We just chose." Eleanor understood exactly what he meant. The family she'd been born into was gone. The family she'd married into had been built on lies. But this family, the one she'd assembled from $1, 2 orphan boys, and the wreckage of her husband's choices, This family was real in a way nothing else had ever been. "Come on," she said, linking her arm through Lucas's. "It's getting cold, and Noah probably has Grace convinced that cookies constitute a proper dinner." They walked back to the cabin together, to the warm light spilling from the windows and the sound of Noah's laughter and Grace's delighted squeals. To home, in all its imperfect, hard-won glory. Spring came as it always did, with mud and green shoots and the exhausting work of planting. But this spring carried something different. Hope, maybe, or just the quiet confidence of people who'd survived the worst and knew they could handle whatever came next. Eleanor stood in the garden one April morning, Grace toddling between the rows while Lucas and Noah worked the far field. She could hear their voices carried on the wind, could see them working in that synchronized way they'd developed, brothers who'd learned to read each other's movements through years of survival. Grace stumbled and sat down hard, looking up at Eleanor with wide eyes, as if checking whether this warranted crying. "You're all right, little one," Eleanor said, offering her hand. "Up you go." Grace grabbed her mother's hand and pulled herself up, determined and stubborn, and already showing signs of the fighter she'd need to be to thrive in this hard country. Looking at her daughter, Eleanor felt the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. Thomas's abandonment of his brothers, his death, her desperate journey to the orphanage with $1, the winter that had tried to kill them, Grace's early birth, Noah's brush with pneumonia, the slow grinding work of paying off debt and holding on to land and building something real from nothing. It had been brutal. It had been unfair. It had broken her and remade her into someone harder and stronger and more honest than she'd been before. And she wouldn't change a single moment of it, because that suffering had given her Lucas and Noah, had taught her what family really meant, had shown her that sometimes the things you buy for $1 turn out to be priceless. Years later, when Grace was old enough to ask questions, she would want to know about her father, and Eleanor would tell her the truth, the good and the bad, the love and the lies, the man Thomas had been and the one he'd failed to be. But she would also tell her about the brothers he'd left behind, about how they'd saved Eleanor's life and Grace's life and the life of the ranch, about how they'd chosen to stay when they could have left, about how they'd built a family from the wreckage of broken promises. And Grace would grow up calling Lucas and Noah her brothers, because that's what they were. Not uncles, not hired help, but brothers in the way that mattered, people who showed up, who stayed, who chose love even when it was hard. The story Eleanor had stepped into that December day at the orphanage had seemed simple enough. A widow buying labor for $1, a desperate gamble to save a failing ranch. But like all good stories, it had twisted and complicated and revealed itself to be about something else entirely. About forgiveness and choice. About how family wasn't something you were born into, but something you built with intention and courage. About how the worst circumstances could sometimes gift you with the exact people you needed, even if you didn't know you needed them. Eleanor called Grace over, scooped her up, and walked toward the field where her sons, because that's what Lucas and Noah were now, truly and completely, were taking a water break in the shade. "Looking good," she called out. "Another week and we'll have the whole south field planted." "Might do the west section too," Lucas said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Weather's holding and we've got enough seed." The west section was part of what we sold to Garrett. "Was?" Lucas grinned. "He stopped by yesterday while you were in town. Says he's getting older, doesn't need as much land as he thought. Offered to sell us back 10 acres at a fair price." Eleanor felt something warm bloom in her chest. Not just at the possibility of reclaiming some of their land, but at the casual way Lucas said us, as if there was no question that they were partners in this enterprise, equals in every way that mattered. "Can we afford it?" she asked. "Not yet, but maybe by fall, after the wheat harvest." Lucas's expression turned serious. "If you want to, I mean. It's your land, your decision." "Our land," Eleanor corrected gently. "Our decision. All of us." She saw the impact of those words in Lucas's face, in the way his shoulders straightened and his eyes brightened. Saw Noah's similar reaction, the quiet kid who'd stopped speaking for months in the orphanage, but who sang to the cows now and told Grace elaborate stories before bed. These were her sons. This was her family, and this land, this hard, unforgiving, beautiful land, was their home. Not because a piece of paper said so, Not because blood or marriage dictated it, but because they'd chosen it, all of them, again and again through every hardship and setback and small victory. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth and the people on it. There was work to be done, as there always was. Fields to plant, animals to tend, a cabin to maintain, a child to raise, a future to build from the ashes of the past. But for this moment, Eleanor let herself just stand there with her daughter in her arms and her sons beside her, feeling the weight of what they'd survived and the promise of what lay ahead. They'd started with $1 and a desperate hope. They'd built something worth far more than money could measure. And that, Eleanor thought, was a story worth telling.